And I'm done waiting. We have a witness. You are being detained. Hands behind your back. Now.
And I am telling you, officer, that I am a judicial officer. You are interfering with official judicial business.
The sun was high and unforgiving, bleaching the clean concrete of the Westwood Plaza and making the chrome trim on the patrol car gleam with an almost painful intensity. Officer Frank Miller squinted as he stepped out, the blast of midday heat a physical presence. It was the kind of call he hated, a vague public disturbance in a place where the biggest disturbance was usually a dropped latte. Across the manicured courtyard, dotted with tasteful iron benches and newly planted crepe myrtles, he saw their subject. She was a black woman, maybe in her late 30s, dressed in a sharply tailored navy blue pantsuit that looked out of place and far too warm for the weather. She wasn't yelling or causing a scene. She was just standing there, next to a large digital city information kiosk, speaking into her phone with a low, intense cadence. A small, nervous-looking crowd of shoppers and office workers kept their distance, pretending not to watch.
"This is it?"
Miller muttered to his partner, Officer Dave Davis, as the older man joined him on the sidewalk. "Looks like a business call to me." Dispatch said shouting, mention of property damage. Davis replied, his voice calm and measured. He had a decade on Miller, and it showed in the easy way he wore his uniform and the deliberate way he surveyed the scene. He wasn't looking at the woman. He was looking at the kiosk, the crowd, the angles. "Let's just see what's what. Easy does it." Miller grunted in response. Easy wasn't his preferred gear. He saw a situation and wanted to resolve it, file the report, and move on. This woman, with her expensive suit and her complete lack of awareness that two uniformed officers were now approaching, was an obstacle. She held the phone to her ear with one hand and made a sharp, dismissive gesture with the other, a motion clearly directed at whatever voice was on the other end of the line. Her posture was ramrod straight, a column of coiled energy in the placid plaza. The crowd parted for the officers like a school of fish avoiding a predator. The air was thick with the scent of hot pavement and unspoken curiosity. Miller could feel the eyes on his back. He hated an audience. It always complicated things. People got brave or stupid when they thought they had backup. "Ma'am," Miller started, his voice a little too loud, a little too sharp. The woman didn't even turn her head. She held up a single imperious finger, the universal sign for "wait a minute." The gesture was so casual, so utterly dismissive of his uniform and his authority, that it stopped Miller dead in his tracks. He felt a hot flush creep up his neck. He looked over at Davis, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Patience. But Miller's patience was a shallow well on a hot day. He took another step forward. The woman's voice was now audible, a crisp, professional tone that carried a clear weight of command. "No, the motion to compel is non-negotiable. File it by 3 p.m. or the deal is off the table. I don't care about their scheduling conflicts. That's a them problem." She paced a single step to the left, her back now almost completely to them. It felt like a deliberate slight. To her, they were just part of the scenery, background noise to her clearly more important world. Davis put a light hand on Miller's arm, a silent request to let him handle it. Miller shrugged it off, his jaw tightening. He wasn't going to be ignored. He was the law here, not some disembodied voice on a phone. The sun beat down. The silence from the crowd was deafening, and the woman just kept talking, oblivious. The stage was set, a quiet and mundane confrontation simmering under the California sun, a simple request for information about to collide with a wall of unyielding focus. The slow burn had begun. "Ma'am, police, I need you to end your phone call," Miller said, his voice now stripped of any pretense of politeness. It was a command. He stood directly behind her, close enough that she would have to acknowledge him. For a moment, she didn't. She continued her conversation, her words sharp and precise. "Inform opposing counsel that their request for a continuance has been denied, unequivocally." Then, as if swatting away an annoying fly, she made a slight turn of her head. Her eyes didn't meet his. They flickered towards his general direction before returning to a fixed point on the horizon. With her free hand, she made a short, impatient flicking gesture. And then came the single word, clipped and cold as ice. Busy. It wasn't an explanation. It wasn't an apology. It was a dismissal, an order. It hung in the hot, still air between them, a stunning breach of unspoken social and legal protocol. Miller felt the blood pound in his ears. Busy? He had his badge, his gun, the full weight of the city behind him, and this woman was telling him she was busy. He exchanged a look with Davis, whose expression was a careful mask of neutrality, but Miller could see the flicker of surprise in his partner's eyes. This was new territory. They dealt with screamers, runners, liars, and fighters. They hadn't dealt with this calm, absolute, and authoritative refusal to even engage. "Ma'am, it's not a request," Miller pressed on, his voice rising in volume. "We're conducting an investigation. You need to terminate the call now." She finally turned her head fully, her eyes, dark and intelligent, sweeping over him from head to toe. It wasn't a look of fear or defiance. It was a look of appraisal, as if she were evaluating a piece of furniture that had been placed inconveniently in her path. She held his gaze for a long second, then turned away again, bringing the phone back to her ear. "Hold one moment, Daniel," she said into the phone, her voice softening just a fraction before hardening again. "I have a minor interruption to deal with." The condescension was a slap in the face. A minor interruption. Miller took a half-step forward, his hand instinctively moving towards his belt. Davis was there instantly, a solid presence at his side, his voice cutting through the tension. "Let me try, Frank." Miller backed off, but his fists were clenched. He could feel the crowd watching, feel their judgment. Were they seeing two professional officers trying to do their job, or two men being stonewalled by a woman in a power suit? The narrative was slipping away from him, and he hated it. He watched as Davis stepped forward, adopting a different, less confrontational posture. But the woman had already built her wall. She stood there, a fortress of purpose, her phone call the impenetrable keep. She had drawn a line in the clean, sun-baked concrete of the plaza, and Miller knew, with a certainty that settled like lead in his gut, that they were about to be forced to cross it. The simple disturbance call was spiraling, the woman's quiet refusal a greater challenge than any shouted threat he'd ever faced. "Ma'am," Officer Davis began, his tone a deliberate counterpoint to Miller's abrasive edge. It was the voice he used for scared witnesses and agitated homeowners, calm, respectful, and firm. "My name is Officer Davis. This is Officer Miller. We've been dispatched to this location regarding a 911 call about a public disturbance and potential vandalism. Your name has been mentioned, so we are legally obligated to ask you a few questions." He paused, letting the words sink in, giving her a chance to process the official nature of their inquiry. He was laying out the procedure, showing her the framework they were operating within. It was an invitation to cooperate, a way for her to engage without losing face. He saw her shoulders tense slightly. She had heard him, there was no doubt. The woman slowly lowered the phone from her ear, but she did not end the call. She held it at her side, the screen still lit. She turned to face Davis fully, and for the first time he got a clear look at her face. It was a strong face, with high cheekbones and intelligent eyes that seemed to be analyzing everything about him at once. His posture, his tone, the distance between them. There was no fear there. There was no anger. There was only an immense, profound sense of impatience, as if he were a slow-witted student holding up the entire class. "Officer Davis," she said, her voice smooth and even, each word carefully enunciated. "I am in the middle of a time-sensitive and critical matter. The legal necessity you speak of is, at this moment, secondary to the one I am currently handling." She gave a slight nod towards her phone. "This conversation takes precedence, officers. You will wait." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the statement stunned both men into silence. Not, "Can you give me a moment?" Not, "Is this going to take long?" It was an order. You will wait. She spoke to them as if they were her subordinates, as if their entire purpose for being there was subject to her schedule. The phrase, "takes precedence," echoed in the air. It was legalistic, precise, and utterly dismissive. Davis felt his professional composure begin to crack. He had spent 15 years on the force and had never been addressed with such absolute, unearned authority by a civilian. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you don't determine what takes precedence in a police investigation," he said, trying to keep the edge out of his voice. "We have a complaint. We have a location. We have you. We need your statement." She met his gaze without flinching. A small, humorless smile touched her lips for a fleeting second. "You have a complaint from an unknown party. You have a location. And you have me, a citizen, engaged in a lawful activity. You have nothing that requires my immediate attention over my professional obligations." She raised the phone again, preparing to put it back to her ear. "You have your procedure, I have mine. Mine is currently more important. Wait." This time, Miller didn't wait for Davis. He stepped forward, planting himself directly in her path. "That's it. We're done waiting." The woman's gaze shifted to Miller. The look she gave him was arctic. It was a silent, powerful challenge. She was daring him to escalate, confident in her position. It was a battle of wills now, fought with glances and posture in the middle of a sunlit plaza. Davis knew they were past the point of polite requests. The woman had made her position clear. She believed her authority, whatever its source, trumped theirs. And in doing so, she had turned a simple inquiry into a direct confrontation with the law they represented. "What the hell is her problem?" Miller hissed, stepping back to confer with Davis just out of the woman's earshot. They stood near a planter filled with vibrant, heat-wilted flowers, creating a small island of privacy. "Professional obligations? Who does she think she is? The damn president?" "Keep your voice down, Frank," Davis cautioned, his eyes still on the woman. She had resumed her phone conversation, her voice a low, indecipherable murmur, but her posture remained rigid and alert. "Something's off. I've never seen anyone that composed. She's not scared, she's not angry, she's just annoyed, like we're gnats. I don't care if she's the Queen of England. A 911 call means we investigate. Obstruction is obstruction," Miller shot back, his frustration making him gesture sharply. "We've given her every chance to comply, every single one." "And escalating with half the plaza watching is a bad look," Davis countered. "We need something more concrete before we force the issue. Let's circle back to the original call, vandalism." As they spoke, a lull in the plaza's ambient noise allowed a few clear phrases from the woman's call to drift over to them. The words were sharp, clinical, and confusing. "Absolutely not. The chain of custody is compromised. Tell Judge Carmichael his temporary restraining order is insufficient. We need the warrants executed by 5. Check the jurisdiction on the secondary property." The words hung in the air, a puzzle they couldn't piece together. Judge Carmichael, warrants, jurisdiction. It sounded official. It sounded important. It sounded like a world far removed from a broken information kiosk in a shopping plaza. Was she a lawyer? A prosecutor? It would explain the attitude, the vocabulary, but it didn't explain the refusal to cooperate. If anything, someone in the legal profession should know better. They should understand the necessity of following police procedure, if only for appearance's sake. "Did you hear that?" Davis said, his brow furrowed. "Warrants? Judge?" "Yeah, I heard it," Miller scoffed. "Probably some paralegal trying to sound important. It doesn't matter. It doesn't give her a free pass to ignore a lawful order. If anything, it makes it worse. She knows the law she's breaking." Miller's agitation was reaching a boiling point. The snippets of her conversation only served to fuel his resentment. To him, she was using her professional status, real or imagined, as a shield and a weapon. She was deliberately placing herself above the very system she seemingly worked within. It was hypocrisy of the highest order. He watched as she paced back and forth, her expensive heels clicking softly on the pavement. She was in a bubble of her own making, a world of judges and motions that had, in her mind, completely eclipsed the reality of the 2 armed police officers standing 10 feet away. The whispers of frustration between the 2 officers grew more heated. Davis argued for caution, for finding the original caller, for building a case before they acted. Miller argued for immediacy, for asserting their authority and ending the ridiculous standoff. And all the while, the woman on the phone continued to direct a legal battle from a public courtyard, unknowingly fueling the very conflict that was about to engulf her. The eavesdropped words, meant to clarify her importance, had only hardened Miller's resolve to prove that, here and now, she had none. "We need the complainant," Davis said, making a decision. "We're spinning our wheels here. Frank, stay with her. Don't engage. Just be present. I'm going to talk to the crowd." Miller gave a curt nod, his eyes fixed on the woman. He took up a position by a bench, a silent, uniformed statue of impatience. Davis, meanwhile, approached the small cluster of onlookers who were still trying to appear casual. He scanned their faces, looking for the one that showed more than just curiosity. He found it in a young man in a wrinkled polo shirt, clutching a messenger bag to his chest. His eyes darted nervously between the officers and the woman on the phone. "Excuse me, sir," Davis said, his voice gentle. "Did you happen to see what occurred here about 15 minutes ago?" The man flinched, as if caught doing something wrong. I didn't call you guys. I don't want to get involved." "You're not in any trouble. We're just trying to figure out what happened," Davis reassured him. "Any information would be helpful." The young man licked his lips and glanced at the woman again. "She was arguing," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Really loud. With someone on the phone, I think. She got more and more worked up, pacing back and forth, shouting about, I don't know, malpractice or something." He swallowed hard. "Then she turned and kicked the screen. Hard. Right in the middle." Davis's focus sharpened. "She kicked the kiosk?" "Yeah. With her heel," the man confirmed, pointing. "Then she just went right back to her phone call like nothing happened. A security guard from one of the stores came out, tried to talk to her, and she just waved him off. I think he's the one who called you." This was it. This was the missing piece. It wasn't just a vague disturbance anymore. It was a direct statement from a witness, alleging a specific act of vandalism. It changed the entire legal dynamic. They now had more than just a duty to investigate. They had probable cause. "Thank you," Davis said to the young man. "I may need your name and number if you're willing." The man reluctantly gave his details, and Davis keyed them into his department-issued phone. He walked back over to Miller, his stride now filled with a new purpose. "We got it," Davis said in a low voice. "Witness saw her kick the kiosk, right after a loud argument on the phone." Miller's eyes lit up with a grim satisfaction. He looked over at the digital kiosk. From a distance, it had looked fine, but now he focused on the large screen in the center. A spiderweb of cracks radiated from a single impact point, distorting the digital map of the plaza into a kaleidoscope of broken pixels. It had been right there in front of them the whole time, a silent testament to her flash of anger. The witness statement connected her directly to it. The vague whispers of frustration were over. The ground had shifted beneath them. They were no longer just asking for her cooperation in a minor disturbance. They were now investigating a criminal act, and she was their primary and only suspect. The wall of silence she had built around herself was about to come crashing down. Armed with the witness statement and the visual confirmation of the damage, Officer Miller felt a surge of renewed confidence. The ambiguity was gone, replaced by the cold, hard certainty of probable cause. He walked directly toward the woman, his boots making a heavy, deliberate sound on the pavement. Davis followed a step behind, his expression more cautious, a silent brake on his partner's acceleration. "Ma'am, your phone call is over," Miller said. There was no room for negotiation in his voice. "We have a witness and evidence of property damage. You are now officially being detained for investigation into vandalism. Put the phone down." The woman stopped her pacing. She turned to face him, a flicker of genuine surprise in her eyes for the first time. The shift in his tone and language was unmistakable. "Detained?" She repeated the word slowly, as if tasting something foul. "You heard me," Miller confirmed, standing his ground. "The games are over." She looked from Miller's hardened face to Davis's more conflicted one. Then she glanced at the cracked screen of the kiosk, her expression unreadable. She held the phone to her ear one last time. "Daniel, I have to go. It appears I'm being detained. Handle the filing." She ended the call, the abrupt silence feeling louder than all the previous conversation. She slid the expensive device into her jacket pocket. "Now then, officers," she said, her voice dripping with a controlled, icy fury. "Perhaps you can explain the legal basis for this detention, because from where I'm standing, you are on incredibly thin ice." The sheer nerve of it, to be caught red-handed and still try to take the upper hand, sent a fresh wave of anger through Miller. "We have a witness who saw you kick and break that city-owned kiosk. That's called vandalism. That's the basis." The woman's gaze was unwavering. She didn't deny it. She didn't offer an excuse. Instead, she chose a different line of attack, one that completely blindsided them. "And I am telling you," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, "that I am a judicial officer of the state, and you are actively interfering with official judicial business. I suggest you think very, very carefully about your next move." The declaration hung in the air, a grenade with the pin pulled. A judicial officer? A judge? A magistrate? It seemed preposterous, yet it fit. The commanding presence, the legalistic language, the unshakable belief in her own authority. Was it a bluff? A desperate lie from a cornered suspect? Or was it the truth? Miller let out a short, incredulous laugh. "A judge! Right! And I'm the chief of police. Ma'am, you can be the president for all I care. You break something, you answer for it. That's how it works." He had called her bluff. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw no fear, no sign of a lie being exposed. He saw only a cold, hard certainty. It was the look of someone who knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that she was in the right, and that he was making a catastrophic mistake. The confrontation had escalated from a battle of wills to a clash of authorities, one represented by a badge and a gun, the other by a quiet, unyielding claim to power that they could no longer afford to ignore. Officer Davis stepped forward, placing a hand on Miller's chest to subtly push him back a step. He needed to de-escalate, to pull them back from the precipice Miller was rushing towards. The woman's claim, however outlandish it seemed, had to be handled with care. A false claim was obstruction. A true claim was a minefield. "Ma'am," Davis began, his voice a model of forced calm. "We take a claim like that very seriously, but right now the facts on the ground are what we have to deal with. We have a witness who states they saw you strike the kiosk. The screen is clearly broken. That is, at minimum, misdemeanor destruction of property. Your professional status, whatever it may be, does not grant immunity from that." He was laying it out for her, brick by brick. This is the evidence. This is the law. This is what is happening, regardless of who you are. It was her final opportunity to comply, to provide her identification, to give her side of the story and let the system work. He hoped she would see the logic, the inescapable reality of her situation. She listened to his explanation, her head tilted slightly, as if considering a complex legal argument. Her gaze remained locked on him, intense and analytical. For a moment, Davis thought he had broken through. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not fear, but perhaps a calculation, a weighing of options. Then, she gave a slow, deliberate shake of her head. "Officer," she said, her voice devoid of the icy anger it held for Miller, replaced now by a tone of weary disappointment. "You're focused on the wrong infraction. The potential misdemeanor damage to a piece of city equipment is trivial compared to the felony you are both contemplating by interfering with a judicial officer in the performance of her duties. The phone call you forced me to terminate was to direct my clerk to file an emergency injunction related to a child abduction case. The warrants I mentioned were for that case. Every second you waste here has real-world consequences for a child in danger." The weight of her words settled over them. A child abduction case, an emergency injunction. It was a detailed, specific, and horrifyingly plausible scenario. If she was telling the truth, they weren't just making a bad arrest, they were potentially obstructing a frantic, life-or-death legal maneuver. Davis felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He looked at Miller, whose face was a mask of skepticism. "It's a nice story," Miller said, his voice low. "A little too convenient, don't you think? Suddenly it's about a kidnapped kid." "I am giving you one final warning," the woman said, ignoring Miller and speaking directly to Davis, recognizing him as the only one capable of rational thought. "Stand down, take my name, run it, and wait for my attorney to contact your captain. Or proceed and face the consequences. It makes no difference to me now. The damage from your interference is already done." She crossed her arms, a final, non-negotiable posture. She had presented her case. She had given them her final warning. The choice, she made clear, was now theirs. She would not offer another word, not another plea or explanation. Davis looked from her unyielding stance to the broken kiosk, then to his partner's face, which was set like stone. They had reached the end of the road. There was no more talking to be done. There was only action, and he feared, with a growing sense of certainty, that it would be the wrong one. "We can't just let her go, Dave," Miller insisted, pulling his partner aside for one last tense conference. They stood with their backs to the woman, a symbolic but fragile barrier. "Kidnapped kid? Emergency injunction? She's pulling it out of thin air to get out of a vandalism charge. It's a classic misdirection. Don't fall for it." "And if she's not lying, Frank," Davis countered, his voice a low growl of anxiety. "If she's a judge and we're screwing up a major case, this won't just be a complaint. This will be our careers. Gone." "So what's the alternative? We just walk away? Because she said so? Because she claims to be a judge? We look like fools, and we let her get away with property damage right in front of us. We can't. We have a witness. We have the broken screen." Miller's gaze drifted from the kiosk back towards the plaza. His eyes scanned the area, and then they stopped, locking onto something. "And now we have more." He pointed towards a high-end black sedan parked in a spot directly adjacent to the landscaped area with the kiosk. "That's her car, has to be," Miller said. "Look at the bumper." Davis followed his partner's gaze. The rear bumper of the pristine sedan had a small but distinct series of scuffs and chips in the black paint. The scuffs were a familiar shade of municipal gray, the same color as the metal housing of the information kiosk. They were at the perfect height. It wasn't a kick, it was a bump. She had likely backed into it, maybe in a moment of frustration during her phone call, and the impact had shattered the delicate screen. The witness who heard the argument and then saw her near the kiosk assumed she kicked it. The physical evidence told a slightly different but legally identical story. "She backed into it," Davis breathed, the pieces clicking into place. "The witness was wrong about the kick, but right about her being the one who did it." "Doesn't matter how it broke," Miller said, a note of triumph in his voice. "It broke. She's responsible, and she's lying about it by omission. This solidifies it. We have physical evidence linking her vehicle to the scene. It's over. We're doing this." The discovery of the paint scuffs was the final push. It erased the last of Davis's doubt, replacing his fear of her story being true with the certainty of the evidence before him. Her elaborate tale of judicial emergencies now seemed like what Miller had claimed all along, a desperate fabrication to avoid responsibility. She hadn't kicked it in a moment of rage. She'd hit it with her car and was now trying to intimidate her way out of a simple accident report. The whole elaborate, infuriating standoff was over a fender bender. Davis took a deep breath, the hot air feeling heavy in his lungs. He was still uneasy, a nod of professional instinct warning him that something was wrong. But he couldn't ignore the facts. Witness, damaged property, physical evidence on her car, and her consistent, unyielding refusal to cooperate. They had followed procedure. They had given her every chance. They had exhausted all other options. He gave Miller a slow, reluctant nod. "Okay, Frank, let's do it. By the book." The decision was made. The point of no return had been crossed. They turned back to face the woman, their expressions now united in a grim resolve. The time for warnings and negotiations was over. The gears of the law, slow and grinding, were about to catch her in their teeth. Officer Miller stepped forward, a smirk playing on his lips. The satisfaction of being proven right, of finally breaking through her wall of arrogance, was palpable. He stopped a few feet from her, planting his feet in a wide, authoritative stance. "Court's adjourned, ma'am," he said, the words dripping with sarcasm. "You're under arrest for destruction of property and obstructing a police investigation." The woman's eyes widened, the first genuine crack in her armor of composure. The word arrest was a physical blow. She had clearly believed up to that very second that her status and her force of will would prevail. The sight of her shock was a small victory for Miller. "You can't be serious," she breathed, shaking her head in disbelief. "You are making a monumental error." "The only error was you thinking you could lie your way out of this," Miller retorted, reaching for his handcuffs. "Hands behind your back, now." He moved to take her arm, but she instinctively pulled back, a reflexive, defensive motion. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't an attempt to flee. It was the natural human reaction to being grabbed unexpectedly. But in Miller's adrenaline-fueled state, any resistance was defiance. "Don't resist!" he barked, his voice escalating from a command to a threat. He lunged forward more aggressively this time, grabbing her right wrist with a grip of steel. The woman gasped, a sharp intake of breath that was part surprise, part pain. "Let go of me," she said, her voice low and trembling with a rage that was just beginning to surface. "You have no right." "I have every right," Miller snarled, using his grip on her wrist to twist her arm behind her back. "You were given a lawful order. You chose not to comply." The sudden, jarring violence of the moment sent a ripple of shock through the crowd of onlookers. Gasps were audible. A few people raised their cell phones, the small black rectangles a silent witness to the unfolding scene. Davis moved in on her other side, his face grim, his movements more practiced and less aggressive than Miller's, but he was part of the machine now, helping to pin her other arm. The woman stood rigid for a moment, her body vibrating with a potent mixture of indignation and shock. She was a person who spent her life in control, a person who gave orders, who decided fates. To be manhandled like this, to be subjected to such a public and demeaning display of physical force, was a violation that went beyond the simple act of being arrested. It was an assault on her identity, on her entire world. The sneer on Miller's face as he announced the arrest had set the tone. This wasn't just procedure for him, it was personal. It was punishment for her defiance. And the punishment was only just beginning. The woman's instinctive flinch was all the justification Miller needed. He saw it not as a reaction, but as an act of resistance, a physical challenge to his authority. "Stop resisting!" he yelled, his voice cracking with adrenaline, even though her feet remained planted on the ground. With a sharp, violent motion, he twisted her arm higher behind her back, forcing a cry of pain from her lips. Her impeccably tailored jacket bunched up around her shoulders, the fabric straining at the seams. "I am not resisting," she ground out through clenched teeth, her body contorting with the pressure on her shoulder joint. "You pull away, you're resisting," Miller grunted, his face now red with exertion and anger. Her free arm, her left, was still at her side. As Davis moved to secure it, she tensed the muscles in her forearm, a small, involuntary act of defiance. For Miller, it was the last straw. He unclipped his baton. He didn't raise it to strike a full blow, but in a swift, brutal, and entirely unnecessary move, he jabbed the hard tip of the baton directly into the muscle of her forearm. The impact was dull and sickening. The woman cried out again, a sharp, piercing sound of agony, and her arm went limp. The brief moment of resistance was extinguished. Davis, seeing the baton, flinched. It was excessive, a clear violation of their use-of-force policy for a non-violent, non-fleeing suspect, but the act was done. He quickly grabbed her now limp arm and secured it. Miller holstered his baton and snapped the first handcuff around her right wrist, ratcheting it down with a series of sharp metallic clicks. He pulled her arm back, cinching the cuff so tightly that she winced, her fingers immediately starting to lose color. "You're hurting me," she said, her voice strained. "Should have thought of that before you decided to argue." Miller replied coldly as he brought her other hand back and clamped the second cuff on, equally tight. The steel bit into her skin. She stood there, defeated, her arms painfully wrenched behind her back. A deep, angry bruise was already beginning to bloom on her left forearm where the baton had struck, a dark purple mark against her skin, starkly visible below the crisp white cuff of her blouse. She stared straight ahead, her eyes fixed on nothing, her face a mask of cold, controlled fury. The public humiliation, the physical pain, it was all being processed, catalogued, and stored away behind that silent, powerful gaze. She did not cry, she did not plead. She absorbed the assault, the pain, the indignity, and in the terrifying silence that followed, she made a silent vow. The officers couldn't hear it, but it was as real as the steel on her wrists and the bruise on her arm. This was not over. This was not even the beginning. They had arrested a suspect. They had created an enemy. The walk to the patrol car was a silent parade of shame. Miller held the woman's cuffed arms in a firm grip, propelling her forward. Davis walked ahead, clearing a path through the gawking crowd, his face set in a grim, unreadable expression. No one spoke. The only sounds were the scuff of their shoes on the pavement, the distant murmur of traffic, and the furious, silent breathing of the woman between them. Miller pushed her down into the back seat of the cruiser, a final, unnecessary show of force. The hard plastic was unforgiving. He slammed the door shut, the sound echoing in the plaza. The interior of the car was stiflingly hot, thick with the smell of vinyl and old air freshener. The woman, Judge Evelyn Hayes, though they did not know it, sat perfectly still, staring out the window, her jaw tight. Her mind was a whirlwind of fury and cold, precise legal calculation. The pain from her wrist and the throbbing in her forearm were secondary to the violation of process, the flagrant abuse of power she had just experienced. Miller got in the driver's side and Davis took the passenger seat. The engine rumbled to life and the air conditioning kicked on, blasting lukewarm air into the superheated cabin. Miller picked up the radio handset. "Dispatch, 7 Adam 15, he said, his voice laced with a self-satisfied calm. "Show us en route to central booking with one adult female in custody. Charges are 594, vandalism, and 148, resisting." The radio crackled a confirmation. The official record of her arrest was now logged. Miller glanced in the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting hers for a brief second. He saw no fear. He saw no tears. He saw a look of such profound, icy contempt that it momentarily unsettled him. He quickly looked away. Davis stared straight ahead through the windshield, his hands resting on his knees. He hadn't said a word since the arrest. He was replaying the events in his head, the escalation, Miller's use of the baton, the woman's shocking and persistent claim of being a judicial officer. A deep unease settled in his gut. Procedure was a shield. You followed it, you documented it, and it protected you. But Miller had gone off book with the baton strike, and the woman's confidence, even now sitting cuffed in the back of their car, was unnerving. It wasn't the false bravado of a common criminal, it was something deeper, something rooted in a reality he couldn't yet see. The ride to the precinct was short, but the silence stretched into an eternity. It was a vacuum filled with unspoken thoughts. Miller was thinking of the satisfying report he would write, detailing a belligerent and non-compliant suspect. The woman, Evelyn Hayes, was thinking of the legal storm she was about to unleash, cataloging every procedural misstep, every instance of excessive force, every violation of her rights. And Davis, caught in the middle, was thinking that they had just made a terrible, terrible mistake. The quiet hum of the engine was the only sound as the patrol car moved through the city streets, carrying its silent, furious passenger toward a reckoning that none of them could yet imagine. The booking area of the central precinct was a drab, sterile environment, smelling of disinfectant and despair. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on the linoleum floors and cinder-block walls. Officer Miller led the woman to the high counter where a paunchy, bored-looking desk sergeant named Henderson sat behind a thick pane of plexiglass. "Got a live one for you, Hendy," Miller said with a grin, pushing the arrest report through the slot. Vandalism and resisting. Sergeant Henderson grunted, not looking up from his crossword puzzle. Name? He droned, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. Miller looked at the woman. Go on, tell the man your name, or should I put you down as Jane Doe, the judicial officer? The sarcasm was thick. The woman lifted her chin, her eyes burning with a cold fire. She looked directly at Sergeant Henderson, ignoring Miller completely. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear, steady, and filled with an authority that cut through the tired air of the booking room. My name is Evelyn Hayes. She paused for a beat. Hayes. Henderson typed the name into the system without much interest. He tabbed over to the next field. Occupation? He mumbled, his eyes still on the screen. Superior Court Judge, she said. The words landed with the force of a physical impact. Miller let out a snort of derisive laughter. Yeah, right. Put her down as unemployed and delusional. But Sergeant Henderson wasn't laughing. His fingers froze over the keyboard. His eyes, which had been half closed with boredom, were now wide open, fixed on the monitor in front of him. A single high-priority flag had popped up on his screen next to the name he had just entered. It was a judiciary security alert, an officer safety warning that also served as a VIPB notification. It was accompanied by a picture. The stern, professional woman in the photo on his screen was the exact same woman standing cuffed on the other side of the plexiglass. Her title was listed in bold red letters. The Honorable Evelyn Hayes, Superior Court of California, Criminal Division. Henderson's face went pale. The blood drained from it so fast, he looked like he'd seen a ghost. He slowly, deliberately pushed his chair back from the counter. He looked from the screen to the woman, and then to Officer Miller, his expression a mixture of terror and disbelief. "Oh, Christ," Henderson whispered, his voice cracking. He swallowed hard. "Frank, what did you do?" Miller's smirk vanished, replaced by a confused frown. "What are you talking about? I arrested a vandal." "No," Henderson said, his voice shaking as he slowly stood up, his eyes locked on the woman with a newfound expression of profound respect and horror. "No, you didn't." He fumbled for the intercom button on his console, his hand trembling. "Lieutenant, I need you in booking immediately. We have a Code 10 situation." A Code 10 was an unofficial but universally understood signal for a departmental catastrophe in progress. Miller's blood ran cold. The woman, Judge Evelyn Hayes, stood perfectly still. She didn't smile. She didn't say, "I told you so." She just watched, her dark, intelligent eyes missing nothing as the world of the two officers who had arrested her began to crumble around them. The bombshell had detonated. The atmosphere in the booking area transformed in an instant. The usual sluggish pace evaporated, replaced by a frantic, palpable panic. A door burst open, and Lieutenant Mark Jennings, a man whose normally placid face was now a mask of alarm, strode into the room. He was a shift commander, a man who had seen it all, but the look on Sergeant Henderson's face told him this was something new. "What is it, Henderson? What's the Code 10? Jennings demanded, his eyes scanning the room. They landed on Miller, then Davis, who had been quietly observing, and finally on the cuffed woman standing with an almost regal calm at the counter. "Sir," Henderson stammered, pointing a trembling finger at his monitor. "Check the screen. 7 Adam 15 just brought her in." Jennings moved behind the counter, his eyes quickly absorbing the information on the screen. He read the name, the title, the security alert. He looked through the plexiglass at Judge Evelyn Hayes. Recognition dawned, followed by a wave of pure, unadulterated horror. He had seen her picture in departmental bulletins. He may have even testified in her courtroom once or twice. "My God," Jennings breathed. He turned on Miller, his voice a low, furious hiss. "Are you insane? What were the circumstances of this arrest?" "Sir, she was non-compliant," Miller started, his voice defensive, the swagger gone, replaced by a growing sense of dread. "She vandalized city property, refused to identify herself, and resisted..." Unlock her cuffs, Jennings snapped, cutting him off. Now! He didn't wait for Miller to comply. He grabbed a spare key from Henderson's desk, strode out from behind the counter, and approached Judge Hayes himself. Your Honor, he said, his voice thick with apology. I am Lieutenant Jennings. On behalf of this department, I am so sorry. There has been a catastrophic error. He fumbled with the lock on the handcuffs. The cuffs sprang open, freeing her. Judge Hayes brought her hands around to her front, rubbing her raw, red wrists. She looked down at the dark, ugly bruise on her forearm, then back up at the lieutenant. Her expression was unreadable, a sheet of ice. Your apology is noted, Lieutenant, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. But it is not accepted. The panic in the room ratcheted up another notch. Miller stood frozen, the full weight of his actions crashing down on him. Davis looked like he was going to be sick. He had felt in his gut that this was wrong, and he hadn't done enough to stop it. I need a private room, now, Judge Hayes commanded, her voice regaining its full, authoritative power. I need my phone, and then I need to speak with your chief of police and the head of your internal affairs division. In that order. Yes, Your Honor. Of course, Your Honor, Jennings said, practically tripping over himself to comply. He gestured frantically. This way, please. Henderson, get her property back to her immediately. Miller, Davis, my office. Don't speak to anyone. Don't touch your radios. Just go. Now. The two officers, stripped of their authority and their composure, turned and walked like men heading to the gallows. The booking room, which moments before had been the site of Miller's triumph, had become the scene of their career immolation. As Judge Hayes was escorted respectfully to a private office, the entire precinct seemed to hold its breath. The chain of command had been shattered, and a crisis of unprecedented proportions was just beginning to unfold. Within the hour, the precinct was a hive of controlled chaos. The chief of police had been summoned from a charity dinner, and the head of the Internal Affairs Bureau, IAB, had arrived with a team of investigators. Miller and Davis were immediately separated, placed in two different sterile interview rooms in the station's administrative wing. The air in these rooms was always cold, the walls bare, the furniture bolted to the floor. They were places for breaking down cops, not for writing reports. Officer Frank Miller sat across a metal table from two IAB detectives, a man and a woman, both with impassive, unreadable faces. The power dynamic had been completely inverted. An hour ago, he was the one in control, the one asking the questions. Now, he was the suspect. Officer Miller, the male detective, Detective Evans, began, his voice flat. We're going to go over the incident at the Westwood Plaza. I need you to walk me through it from the beginning. And before you start, I'm advising you now, you have the right to have a union representative present. I don't need a rep, Miller said, trying to project a confidence he no longer felt. I did everything by the book. Then you won't mind if we review your body-worn camera footage as you talk, the female detective, Detective Chen, said, gesturing to a laptop on the table. It wasn't a question. As Miller began his recitation of the events, the detectives played the footage. They watched the initial approach, heard his own sharp, impatient voice. They saw Judge Hayes's dismissive gesture. They watched the entire slow-motion train wreck unfold on the small screen. When it got to the part where he used the baton, Evans paused the video. The image of Miller jabbing the tip into her forearm was frozen on the screen. Officer Miller, Evans said, his voice dangerously soft. The suspect was not physically assaulting you. She was not attempting to flee. Can you explain the justification for this use of force? She was tensing up. It's a pre-assaultive indicator, Miller argued, the words sounding weak even to his own ears. I used a compliance strike to prevent escalation. It's a trained technique. A technique for a combative suspect, yes, Chen interjected. Not for a woman in a business suit who is verbally non-compliant. Let's talk about her claim of being a judicial officer. Did you at any point attempt to verify this claim? Sir, people lie all the time. They say they're lawyers, cops, mayors. It's a common tactic to avoid arrest. I had no reason to believe her, Miller said. And every reason to disbelieve her? Evans countered. Did her language, her demeanor, not suggest a familiarity with the legal system? Meanwhile, in another room, Officer Dave Davis was telling his side of the story. His account was less defiant, colored with a weary resignation. I advised Officer Miller to wait, Davis said, his voice heavy. I felt the situation was being unnecessarily escalated. But once the witness came forward and we found the paint transfer on her vehicle, we had probable cause. My hands were tied. Were they? The investigator in his room asked. You're the senior officer, Davis. You had the authority to overrule him, to take control of the scene. Why didn't you? Davis didn't have a good answer. He just shook his head slowly. I should have, he admitted, the words tasting like ash. I had a bad feeling from the start. I should have trusted my gut. The interrogations went on, circling the same points. Miller defended his every action as standard procedure for a non-compliant suspect. Davis admitted his own failures to intervene. And all the while, the body cam footage played on, an objective, damning witness that contradicted Miller's justifications and confirmed Davis's fears. The truth of the matter was being laid bare, frame by painful frame, in the cold, unforgiving light of an internal affairs review. The chief of police, a man named Michael O'Malley, sat in his office, the door closed. The wood-paneled walls, usually a source of comfort and authority, felt like they were closing in on him. On his desk lay a preliminary report from IAB, and he had just finished watching the full, unedited body cam footage from both Miller and Davis. He had also just gotten off a 10-minute phone call with the city's mayor, a call that had been brief, brutal, and left no room for ambiguity. The political and legal fallout was already beginning, and it was going to be a firestorm. He looked at the footage again, pausing on Miller's smirking face as he said, "Court's adjourned, ma'am." It was the single most damning moment. It laid bare the officer's intent. It wasn't about enforcing the law, it was about ego, about punishing someone for perceived disrespect. The baton strike was the physical manifestation of that ego. Davis's role was one of passive complicity, a failure of leadership that was, in its own way, just as damaging. There was no room for a lengthy investigation. There was no time to wait for the union to posture and protest. The victim was a superior court judge. The evidence was on video. The city was facing a monumental lawsuit, a public relations nightmare, and a crisis of confidence in its police force. A swift, decisive action was the only way to begin to cauterize the wound. He picked up his phone and summoned Lieutenant Jennings. "Bring them in," he ordered. A few minutes later, Miller and Davis were escorted into the chief's office. They stood at attention before his large oak desk, their faces pale and drawn. They knew what was coming. Chief O'Malley didn't ask them to sit. He stood up, his face a grim mask of disappointment and fury. "I have reviewed the preliminary report and the evidence from your arrest of Judge Evelyn Hayes," he began, his voice cold and hard as granite. "I saw a routine call handled with staggering incompetence. I saw a complete lack of professionalism, a failure of de-escalation, and an appalling use of excessive force. I saw an officer, Miller, driven by ego, and a senior officer, Davis, who failed to intervene." He paused, letting the weight of his words crush them. "You have not just arrested a judge. You have disgraced this uniform. You have violated your oath, and you have exposed this department and this city to catastrophic liability." He picked up 2 letters from his desk. "Effective immediately, you are both suspended without pay, pending a full investigation and termination hearing. Your badges, your service weapons, you will surrender them to Lieutenant Jennings now. You are to have no contact with any member of this department other than your union representative. You will be escorted from this building." The hammer had fallen. The words were clinical, final. Miller opened his mouth to protest, to argue, but the look on the chief's face silenced him. Davis just nodded slowly, a single defeated gesture of acceptance. There was nothing to say. Their careers, as they knew them, were over. ended not in a hail of gunfire or a heroic act, but in a sunlit plaza over a broken screen and a bruised ego. Lieutenant Jennings stepped forward to collect their equipment, the final, humiliating ritual of their downfall. The two officers, now just civilians in uniform, were led out of the office, the door closing behind them with a quiet, definitive click. The official report, released to the press a week later after a flurry of legal and political maneuvering, was concise and brutal. It stated that Officer Frank Miller and Officer David Davis were suspended indefinitely pending termination proceedings for violations including unprofessional conduct, failure to follow departmental procedure, and excessive use of force. The city issued a formal public apology to the Honorable Evelyn Hayes, who had, through her attorney, filed a notice of intent to sue for assault, battery, false arrest, and violation of civil rights. The incident at Westwood Plaza became a local flashpoint, a case study in how a minor interaction could spiral into a major departmental crisis through arrogance and poor judgment. The internal review of the department's use of force protocols began, a long and arduous process of trying to fix a culture that had allowed a Frank Miller to flourish and a David Davis to stand by and watch. The repercussions rippled outwards. The witness who saw the kick was re-interviewed and expressed deep regret, admitting the car's proximity made a collision more likely. The security guard who made the initial call was frustrated that his attempt to handle the situation calmly had been steamrolled. And in courtrooms across the city, defense attorneys began whispering about the Westwood Plaza incident, using it as a new benchmark for questioning police credibility. The fallout was just beginning. The quiet of Judge Hayes's chambers felt different now. The heavy law books lining the walls, once symbols of order and reason, now seemed to whisper of the chaos just outside the door. The throbbing in her forearm had subsided, but the memory of the cold steel and the officer's sneer remained. In the silent aftermath, the question was not just what happened, but why. Why did an officer with a decade on the force, a man like Miller, abandon procedure for brute force over a perceived slight? Perhaps his badge had become less a symbol of public trust and more a shield for his own insecurities. A woman who did not immediately bend to his will, who did not show the requisite fear, was not just a non-compliant citizen, she was a threat to his fragile sense of authority. His actions weren't about law enforcement, they were about dominance. And Officer Davis, the good cop, was paralyzed by a culture of partnership that often prioritizes loyalty to a fellow officer over the duty to protect the public from that same officer. His silence was a choice, and in its own way as damaging as Miller's aggression. If only things had been different. If only Judge Hayes, in that moment of crisis, had taken 30 seconds to say, "Officers, I am Judge Hayes. I am handling an emergency injunction for a child abduction. Here is my identification. Give me 2 minutes to delegate and I am all yours." Would that have changed the outcome? Perhaps. It would have shifted the dynamic, forcing them to confront her status directly rather than dismiss it as a lie. And if only Officer Davis had trusted his veteran instincts, stepping in front of his hot-headed partner and saying, "Frank, stand down, let me handle this. We will verify her claim before we lay one hand on her." That single act of courage could have averted the entire disaster. Protection for her lay in de-escalation and early identification. For the officers, it lay in patience and procedure. Ultimately, the incident serves as a stark reminder that authority without wisdom is tyranny, and procedure without judgment is a blunt instrument. A badge and a gavel are both symbols of immense power, but that power is granted by the people, and it is meant to serve justice, not ego. The moment we forget that, the system begins to crack, just like the screen of that information kiosk, a small act of violence that revealed a much deeper fracture beneath the surface. What do you think? Was there any point at which this situation could have been peacefully resolved, and who held the most power to do so? Do you believe Officer Miller's actions were a result of poor training or personal character? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you value these stories, please consider supporting the channel.